Hello. Oh, I emailed you.
Oh, I wrote this down. I just went online this morning. It sent me a credit. How are you? To see you. Great to see you too. It is very warm. It's the perfect sweater for the sweat. It's great to see your wife on Saturday night. Yeah, it's amazing the work that you're doing for them. I'm trying to, think, like, the other side of the rabbit, like the community, but no, it's great. Yeah, yeah. Things are going well. Good, thank God. Oh, yeah, how about you? How's good going? It's really good. Yeah, yeah. That's that. The whole world can turn upside down, and that never changes. All steady streams of people, very intelligent, motivated. That's great. Yeah, it's really amazing. I think we've proven it, like, with COVID, and before, administrations there, like, I think it's now, we can now say this positive, nothing will ever change this year. That's amazing. Yeah, that's really fantastic. Yeah. What's going on? Why you need it? Sure, a lot. Yeah, it's a little bit hectic. So she's been fantastic. Oh, I saw one. Yeah, yeah. So she had much to do. Yeah, somewhat. She's sort of getting herself oriented. So right, so learning to land. So that's been. Right, that dynamic. Yeah. I think that the litigation is ongoing, but I think. Yeah. Are they getting more settled? So I was hoping that it would be around. Yeah. Kids who have not yet attracting numbers have been bumped up, which is important. Like, yeah, yeah. And then, it's on my class each of the last 2 years. It's amazing. Nobody's not taking it. No. He likes to fly out there. Yeah, he's sure. Yeah. Okay, great. All right, so let me just thank the sponsors. Okay, good morning to everybody. Still morning for another few minutes over here. I wanted to thank our sponsors. Effie, can you hear me in the back, or it's not projecting so well? I don't need the mic. Okay. My wife has been saying that for years now. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to thank our sponsors. First of all, Moshe and Markovitz, who are sponsoring the entire month of learning. And they wrote a beautiful note here for the opportunity to continue learning in a congenial environment. That's a compliment to everybody here. So thank you so much. By the Rudolph family in honor of the bar mitzvah of their grandson, Gabriel Rudolph, which is marked on this Shabbos Hanukkah, which is a great time for a bar mitzvah. Fran Mermelstein in memory of her beloved husband, Shelley, who passed away so tragically, but had so many Maisim Tov building up this side of Teaneck, Yosef Shmuel Shmalka, Ben Yitzchak Berivka. The yard site is today, it's Bo Bayom, and also by Beth and Morris Applebaum in memory of Beth's mother, Henrietta Feinerman, Ita Miriam Bas Chaim Yaakov, whose yard site is going to be marked on the third day of Hanukkah. So again, we're so appreciative, for all of these dedications, which make our learning possible. Professor Mermelstein has been with us many, many times to our benefit. As you know, he's Associate Professor of Bible and Second Temple Literature at Yeshiva University, also the chair of the Department of Bible, Hebrew, and Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University, and the Assistant Director, and this is in conjunction with Cardoza, of the YU Center for Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization, and more controversially, the Israeli Supreme Court project. But if you don't like the judicial reform, don't blame it on him. That's not what it's about. It's not his fault. He's not making any trouble over there. This is academic enterprise. As you'll see, the topic today is extremely timely and relevant regarding the Gezeros, the various edicts of Antiochus against practices of Judaism, of Yahadus, and what motivated that exactly. And so, as we've been having our series of Hanukkah different shiurim, now we have a little bit more from a academic and historical perspective. So it's really wonderful to be able to welcome back Dr. Mermelstein to study together with us this week.
Very much. So I'm usually here after Hanukkah. It happens to be that Hanukkah falls out very late this week. So in general, I'm not able to actually share any thoughts on Hanukkah. So I'm excited to actually study together some historical dimensions of the Chag. So what I've decided to do is, over the course of 3 talks, to address what I think are maybe 3 of the foundational questions, problems, dilemmas that historians face when dealing with the holiday of Hanukkah. Today's lecture class is going to be on the topic of why did Antiochus forbid the practice of Judaism? And as we'll see in a couple of minutes, there are real historical questions that are raised by Antiochus's persecutions. That's what we're going to talk about today. Next week, we're going to talk about the relationship between what are regarded as the 2 miracles associated with Hanukkah. Of course, the miracle involving the regeneration of the oil. But what I want to focus on next week is the other piece of the miracle, which I think generally is kind of given less press, which is the miracle of the victory of the Hashmonaim over the Seleucids. So we're going to focus especially on that. How does that factor into the celebration of Hanukkah? And then that'll be next week. And then I think I'm coming back again 2 weeks after that. And I'll talk about the legacy of the Hashmonaim. So if the Hashmonaim were the champions of, say, they were the champions of traditionalism, those who stood up for Jewish rights to observe their ancestral traditions, what exactly is their legacy? Where does their commitment go from there? Okay, so that's going to be my 3rd talk. Okay, so getting started with why did Antiochus forbid the practice of Judaism? So let me set the stage by explaining why this is such a dilemma for historians, because straightforwardly, it seems like the answer, I think, is relatively simple, namely the fact that Antiochus was an anti-Semite. Antiochus was somebody who was opposed to Jewish practice. If that's all that the edict boils down to, so then there's actually nothing problematic at all. The problem is that asserting that Antiochus was anti-Semitic is a problem for a number of reasons. So let me try to lay out the 4 basic problems with assuming that Antiochus's edict persecuting the Jews was simply motivated by anti-Semitism. Okay. Now, before I do that, let me just get everybody chronologically oriented so that we know exactly what the dates are, when exactly we're talking about. And as we'll see, the dates, or at least the relative chronology, will become important. So when we talk about, let's back up a couple of centuries before the story of Hanukkah. So the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, sort of the beginning of the story, takes place in the year 586 BCE. The Jews are exiled, are allowed to come back with the founding of the Persian dynasty under Cyrus the Great in the year 539. Cyrus the Great basically conquers the entire Near East from the Neo-Babylonian Empire, 539. One of the things that he does in his first year, and this we find in Ezra and Nehemiah, and there's some relevant texts from outside of Tanakh as well, is he allows the Jews to return from exile in Babel, what is now going to be Persia, to return and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Beginning basically of the times of the second Beit HaMikdash take place in around the year 538. A small group of Jews goes back, it's really a trickle, not led by Ezra and Nehemiah, who actually appear on the scene a little bit later, but the Beit HaMikdash itself, Bayit Sheni, is not actually built until the year 515. So about a generation passes, 515, we have the building of Bayit Sheni. The Persians are the empire that rules over both Israel and the Near East until the year 332. In the year 332, Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedon, and his army of generals, massive army, comes and defeats the Persians, takes over control of the Near East, and the dust settles over the next couple of years. But Alexander dies in the year 323. 323, his dynasty is basically split primarily among three of his generals, primarily. His general Antigonus gets control of Alexander's holdings to the west, so that is Greece, parts of Western Europe. Seleucus, his general Seleucus I, gets control over Syria, Mesopotamia, and areas to the east. Basically Syria, Mesopotamia, other areas of the east. And a third general, Ptolemy I, gets control over Egypt. Now, what is contested over the course of roughly the next century is control over Israel, control over what is called in Greek sources, Koile Syria. So Koile Syria basically is areas from Lebanon and south. And that area, control over that area is contested between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid dynasty that is founded by Seleucus has its seat of power in Antioch in Syria. And the Ptolemaic dynasty has its seat of power in Egypt in Alexandria. And each of those dynasties vies for control over Koile Syria. Koile in Greek basically just means valley. And so the idea here is that the core of Koile Syria is basically southern Lebanon, northern Israel, where you have mountains and valleys. So and to the south as well. The Ptolemaic dynasty rules over Israel during the course of the 3rd century, during the 200s BCE, and the Seleucid dynasty and Ptolemaic dynasties fight a series of what are known as 5 Syrian wars, in which the Seleucid dynasty challenges Ptolemaic supremacy in Koile Syria. So basically, the Ptolemaic dynasty is challenged for control over Israel, with the Seleucid dynasty finally taking control over Israel in the year 198. Right? And that really, the year 198 is really where the story of Hanukkah gets started, because that really is the point in time at which the Seleucid dynasty based in Syria, and that's going to be the dynasty from which Antiochus emerges. That's when the Seleucid dynasty enters into Jewish history, essentially. Yeah. Okay, so the war is being fought not exclusively in Israel, but it's clear that there was a lot of devastation that took place in Israel. During the course of the 3rd century, it sounds like Jews in Israel were on the side of the Ptolemaic dynasty of the Egyptians. It sounds like by the end of the 5th Syrian War, which ends in 198, it sounds like there was a split among the population in Israel, with some backing the Ptolemaic dynasty initially. And as the tide turned, it seems like more of the population in Jerusalem turned to side with the Seleucid dynasty. And we'll come in a couple of minutes to see what what the benefits were that accrued to the Jews because they sided at the end of the Seleucid dynasty. The king of the Seleucid dynasty that eventually wrests control of Koile Syria, Israel, from the Ptolemaic dynasty was Antiochus III. So this is going to be, Antiochus III is the father of the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. There are going to be 3 kings whose names we're going to have to try to keep track of. Antiochus III is the king who takes control over Koile Syria in 198. He rules until 187. In 187, his son, Seleucus IV, takes over rule of the Seleucid dynasty and control over Israel. Seleucus IV rules until the year 175, when Antiochus IV, the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story, takes control. Okay, that's basically the parameters of our story really run from about 198 for our purposes today, from 198 until roughly 67. 167 is when the story of Hanukkah actually takes place, the persecutions. And what we're going to want to understand is why exactly Antiochus in the year 167 persecuted the Jews. Now, why is that? Why did I say that's a problem? It's a problem for a couple of reasons. It's a problem because polytheism in general, paganism, was a very tolerant ideology. The ideology underlying paganism is basically live and let live. We don't really care who you worship. Your gods or your god are your gods. Our gods are our gods. we don't really interfere in the God that you decide to worship. And basically in the Near East, we basically had one patron God per territory. Basically, the pagan outlook was that each territory, each country is ruled, is associated with one God. We see that in Tanakh already as well. So, for example, in Tanakh, the god of Moab, the land of Moab, is known as Chemosh. The god of Ammon is known as Milcom. And everyone in the Near East recognized that Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh was the god of Israel. He's described as such. There are texts from the ancient Near East, from the time of Tanakh, that talk about Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh as the god of Israel, which means that the Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh is the god over the territory of Israel. And so it's not that these other countries were worshiping multiple gods necessarily. They may have believed in the existence of many gods, but their devotion was directed to the God that had jurisdiction in their country. So polytheism was a tolerant ideology. We don't actually have on record any persecutions coming out of the ancient world, certainly before this point. What happens later is a separate a complication that's not relevant for our purposes. But basically, before the Edict of Antiochus persecuting the Jews in the year 167, we don't actually hear about religious persecution because that would have been completely antithetical to the polytheistic way of thinking about religious devotion. So one problem with assuming that Antiochus was simply a religious crusader is the fact that as a polytheist, just doesn't really compute. That's one problem. Now, that what I'm saying, that he likely was not a religious crusader because, after all, polytheism was a religiously tolerant ideology, runs into one problem, which is the first text that we're going to be looking at. So let me just introduce now, just by way of a little background, the text that we're going to be studying. We're going to be looking at selections from two works known as First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. So these are two completely independent books. It's not like Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Aleph. There is no formal relationship between these two works. They were composed at different times in different languages by different people for different purposes. Just very, very quickly, because I don't want to get bogged down in details of what the differences are, but just broadly speaking, First Maccabees is written in around the year, let's call it, they were probably written around the same time, toward the end of the 2nd century BCE, call it 120, 110, something like that BCE. First Maccabees was written in Hebrew, and some of the early church fathers, 4th and 5th centuries even, still say that they have access to the Hebrew of First Maccabees. And if you look at the Greek translation of First Maccabees, you can see that it's a very faithful translation to the Hebrew, and it seems to be that the underlying text was Hebrew. So, for example, the reason that historians assume that the surviving text of First Maccabees, which is only preserved in Greek, actually translates a Hebrew original is because if you look at the Greek, you have a lot of the style of the Greek is you'll have and translate the Greek, which represents the heavy reliance on the vav that in biblical narrative always means act, right? Right? So you have and Yaakov went and he walked, right? That's just the familiar style of biblical narrative. First Maccabees seems to have been written in that style and then gets translated in a Greek that is very wooden, that is very faithful to the original. So it's written in Hebrew, probably by a court historian of the Hashmonaim. We'll talk about the Hashmonaim, their dynasty, in 2 weeks, but basically probably by a court historian of the Hashmonaim in order to serve to glorify the achievements of the Hashmonaim. More or less, the story of First Maccabees gets started shortly before the persecutions and around the year 168. So we don't actually have a lot of background to the persecutions in First Maccabees. And First Maccabees narrates as far as the formal founding of the Hashmonaim's dynasty in 134. Okay, the dates really, for the most part, are not critical, but it really only begins with the persecutions and runs for about 30 years afterward because it's really focused much more on the Hashmonaim. That's First Maccabees. And we're going to be looking at some passages from First Maccabees along the way. But our primary text is going to be the book of Second Maccabees. because Second Maccabees, also in Greek, Second Maccabees, though, was actually written in Greek. And the introduction to Second Maccabees says that it is an abridgment, a one-book abridgment of a 5-volume work written by someone named Jason of Cyrene. And this person, Jason of Cyrene, or at least the abridgment of his 5-volume work, basically narrates from approximately the year 178 until the year 161. So it's much more focused on the period immediately before the persecutions. Basically, the persecutions take place in the year 167. We have a lot more information in Second Maccabees, going back to 178, than we actually do in First Maccabees itself. So for that reason, Second Maccabees is going to be much more helpful if we want to understand why exactly did Antiochus decide to persecute the Jews. The problem with saying, I'll take the questions in 1 second. The problem with saying that Antiochus persecuted, well, the difficulty with challenging the assumption that Antiochus was a religious crusader is the fact that he seems to be described as a religious crusader in the first text we're going to be looking at. So take a look at the first text, which is from First Maccabees. This is First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 41. And the king wrote to all his kingdom for all to be as one people, and for each to abandon his own precepts. All the nations complied with the dictum of the king. So it sounds very much like Antiochus is being described as a religious crusader. He has this notion in the year 168 that he is going to try to unify all of the people in his empire, which again is Syria and Mesopotamia, areas to the east of Syria. He's going to unify all of them under one religious banner. So he writes to all of them and insists that all of them abandon their ancestral traditions and convert to whatever form of devotion Antiochus wants to impose. Now, it turns out, as this chapter goes on, that the only people that resist are the Jews. Okay, so it sounds on a straightforward reading of this text, like in fact, what I said is the more difficult understanding is actually the correct understanding, namely that Antiochus was a religious crusader. The problem with taking that verse seriously is a few things. First of all, what we're going to see from later is that Second Maccabees seems to say that the persecutions themselves were limited to Judea and Samaria, meaning there were Jews who lived outside of the land of Israel. There was a large Jewish community, for example, in Antioch in Syria, and there were communities, obviously, in Bavel to the east. But there's no indication that Antiochus persecutes the Jews in those areas. And it's not because the Jews in those areas decided to go along with the persecutions. It seems to be it's because Antiochus was focused not on Judaism, but on the land of Israel, on the Jews who lived in the land of Israel. So the question is, why was he focused on the Jews who lived in the land of Israel? But it seems like he had a bone of contention, not with Jews in general, because had it been with Jews in general, he would have persecuted Jews everywhere in his domain. It seems to somehow be focused on Israel. That's one problem with assuming that First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 41 is historically reliable. There's a second problem with taking that verse, which suggests that he was a religious crusader, as historically reliable. And that is that Josephus says that the Samaritans went to Antiochus and asked to be excused from this edict. Meaning, it seems like when Antiochus, when he issues his edict of persecution in the year 167, he extends it not just to the Jews in Israel, but also to the Samaritans whose temple was at Har Gerizim. So they're, for the most part, in sort of the northern area. And it seems like the edict extended to them as well. According to Josephus, the Samaritans went to Antiochus and requested that they be excused from the edict because they said, we are not ethnically Jewish. We actually sort of worship the same God of the Jews, but a little bit different. We're not ethnically Jews in any case, so we should be excused. They weren't saying that we will stop observing our ancestral traditions. The Samaritans also observe a form of kashrus. They also observe the laws of Shabbos. They also observe the laws of bris milah. They weren't saying we're going to abandon all those ancestral traditions, but what they were saying was we shouldn't be included among the people that you want to persecute, which means that Antiochus was not on a religious crusade to unify everyone in his empire under one religious banner. It seems that he was focusing, especially again, on the Jews in the land of Israel. So that's a second problem with assuming that that Antiochus was a religious crusader who sought to unify everyone under one religious banner and therefore persecuted the Jews because they resisted. The third problem with taking that verse seriously, verse that seems to suggest that he was a religious crusader, is the fact that this focuses less on the Jews and more on other nations. What we know archaeologically and from literary sources is that the other nations in the Near East also continue to observe their ancestral traditions even after the persecutions, even after this edict from Antiochus was issued. Meaning, you had forms of devotion that were not Greek in the Near East. One of the major differences between how other nations worshipped their gods and the way that the Greeks worshipped Greek gods was that most ancient Near Eastern people, like the Jews, didn't have statues. They didn't worship idols. They worshipped, for the most part, what are called sort of aniconic. They lacked icons. They lacked sort of images. They worshipped stones, matzevot, standing stones. And what we gather from, again, archaeology and literary sources is that other nations continued to basically worship in the familiar style, the ways that they had always worshipped. They didn't renounce their ancestral traditions simply because Antiochus told them to do so. Now, which again, if they didn't stop observing their ancestral traditions, Antiochus didn't say you have to now begin worshiping Zeus, you have to begin worshiping Dionysus, you have to begin installing statues in your temples. What that again suggests is that Antiochus was not a religious crusader who sought to unify everyone under one religious banner. What Antiochus was trying to do was to single out the Jews in the land of Israel. So now the question is, why was he trying to single out the Jews in the land of Israel? Okay, but one problem then is why a polytheist would have chosen to persecute the Jews. There's a second problem with saying that Antiochus was a religious crusader who sought for some reason to go on this apparently religious crusade, which is that it was very out of character for his family, for the dynasty from which he emerged. I mentioned before that his father, Antiochus III, Antiochus III, was the king of the Seleucid dynasty who took control over Koile, Syria in the year 198. The question came up, on whose side were the Jews? Were they on his side in 198 in the Fifth Syrian War, or were they aligned with his opponent, the Ptolemaic dynasty? The answer seems to be that by the end of the war, the Jews were aligned with Antiochus III, for which Antiochus granted them a number of basically sort of expressing his appreciation. He grants them a number of dispensations. That's what we have here, source 2 from Josephus. Josephus records, in the details of Josephus, that we talked about him a couple of years ago, irrelevant for our purposes, but he records an edict, a letter that Antiochus wrote to the person who was responsible for overseeing the Jews. And in this letter, what you can see is, we're just going to go straight to the bolded section in the middle of page 1. Antiochus says, because out of appreciation for what the Jews have done, I am going to allow the Jews, I'm going to actually pay for the Jews to rebuild some of the destruction in Jerusalem and in the temple in particular. Again, the question was, did the war actually affect Jerusalem? And the answer is yes. But beyond that, Antiochus says two things. He says, in the first place, we have decided on account of their piety to furnish them for their sacrifices an allowance of sacrificial animals, wine, oil, and frankincense, to the value of 20,000 pieces of silver, and sacred ardabe of fine flour in accordance with their native law, and 1,460 medimni of wheat, and 375 medimni of salt. Meaning what Antiochus basically says is that from now on, I'm going to shoulder the burden of supporting the temple myself. I will pay for all of the korbanot and all of the other materials that are necessary for the regular functioning of the Beit HaMikdash. So he's assuming a significant financial responsibility, and he does two other things. He says, secondly, this is the bolded section a few lines later, and all the members of the nation shall have a form of government in accordance with the laws of their country. He says that I am now enshrining as official Seleucid law observance of Torah on the part of the Jews, right? Meaning I am endorsing their right to observe the Torah. And the third thing that he says further on is he basically says that I'm also offering a tax exemption to all of the Kohanim and all of the leaders. So there really are two very important things that Antiochus III does in the year 198 when he takes control of Coile Syria. He basically releases the Jews from having to make any sort of payment of tribute, and he releases the Jews from having to basically abandon their Judaism. Right? They now don't owe him any taxes, and they don't, and they can observe their ancestral traditions. They can observe the Torah. What we know about the way that sovereignty, that freedom was thought about in antiquity, basically sovereignty consisted of three primary aspects. Basically consisted of freedom from military garrison. You didn't have any soldiers that were being quartered in your city. Freedom from payments of tribute, and freedom to observe your ancestral traditions. So basically what Antiochus was saying was, I am now granting you, for the most part, absolute autonomy, right? I'm still going to rule over you, right? And he does garrison soldiers in Jerusalem, but less as a military presence and more as an administrative presence. Meaning basically what he was saying was, in return, in appreciation for what you did for me, I am going to grant you significant degrees of autonomy. So it's very hard, therefore, this is the second problem with understanding why his son, Antiochus IV, issues this edict, is why is it that only 30 years after his father granted autonomy to the Jews and allowed them to observe the Torah, officially enshrined their rights to observe the Torah as Seleucid law, why exactly did the son, Antiochus IV, persecute the Jews? That really is the second major problem, and that's kind of where we're going to be headed, right? Why exactly did this polytheist? Why exactly did this Seleucid king decide to persecute the Jews in 168, 167? Okay, questions? Say it again. No, so the question was, in what corpus are the books of Maccabees contained? Or are they in the Apocrypha? And the answer is yes. But what you have to keep in mind is that the books of the Apocrypha originally were authored by Jews. So both books of Maccabees, even Second Maccabees, which is written in Greek, is being written by a Jew for Jews. And what we're going to see is Second Maccabees in particular, even though it's written by someone in Greek, is staunchly, the author is staunchly pious, and his conception of history is very theological. Right. Maccabees resembles more Tanakh. Yeah, Maccabees resembles much more Tanakh than let's say Josephus. The theology is very similar to what you'd find in Tanakh. Certainly, First Maccabees, like I said, the style of the Hebrew is much more similar to Tanakh. I think that they were probably modeling themselves much more after Tanakh. That these are books that are being written like 200 years before Josephus, before they're not writing based on the writings of Polybius, Herodotus, Thucydides, the classic historians. Question is why are Maccabees not prominent in terms of people's education? So that's why I'm here educating you guys. Better late than never, right? You're not in elementary school anymore, but yeah. Okay, so maybe that's for next time. For next time we'll talk about other books. What literary remains do we have by a Cheney that somehow was omitted from our education? Okay, so let's begin to sort of count down toward the persecutions. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we're, so we have to answer that, and it's not naive at all. That's the question that we're going to try to work toward. As far as the first question, you're 100% right, meaning we can't necessarily assume that just because his father, but the question is, why did he choose to abandon what had become official imperial policy? Meaning it would be, we at least need to explain why that would be. Meaning, as opposed to just saying, well, if his empire, his father and his brother, Seleucus IV, his predecessor, if they were simply neutral toward the Jews, you could say, look, he just instituted, but why would he completely reverse course? Maybe that's the slightly better way to put it, but you're right. But it at least should raise eyebrows that he's coming from a family that was very supportive. Why all of a sudden was he no longer supportive? I guess that would be the figure. Right, but yeah, very fair question. Okay, so let's work our way toward an answer. So the next stop toward understanding why exactly persecuted the Jews is something that happens in the year 178. And so this is the next source called the Heliodorus Stele. So let me just introduce what the Heliodorus Stele is. In order to understand that, we just need to actually backtrack about a decade. So Antiochus III, the Antiochus that we were talking about, issues that edict supporting the Jews, was engaged in a war against Rome. Basically, was an alliance of kings and kingdoms in the area of the Levant, in the area of the Near East, who waged the war against Rome in the 190s, thinking that maybe they could extend their jurisdiction to the west into Europe. Rome ended up winning that war, and they imposed a very heavy war indemnity that is described as the most onerous in all of history. I don't know exactly how historians calculate that, but somehow if you were to somehow calculate all war indemnities ever imposed on losers by winners in wars, that would be the most onerous. And it wasn't just that now the Seleucid dynasty was on the hook for paying this massive payment to the Romans because they went to war against them. It actually had to be repaid within 10 years, within 12 years. And so the peace that results in the imposition of that war indemnity takes place in the year 188, called the Peace of Apamea, not important. But the Peace of Apamea imposes this tribute that needs to now be repaid by the year 177. Now, the question is, how is the Seleucid dynasty going to manage to come up with funds to repay this massive debt by the year 177? So it becomes clear that now the Seleucid dynasty is going to be strapped for cash. Antiochus III ends up dying actually trying to pillage funds from a temple in Mesopotamia in the year 187. Funds in temples will become an important theme. Temples in antiquity were basically banks, because no one would want to extract funds from a temple. That would have been regarded as sacrilegious. Whichever temple was associated with a god, whichever god was regarded as sort of owning the rights to a temple, would have avenged the loss of the funds from that temple. Therefore, funds in a temple were regarded as basically safe, right? Safe deposits. But Antiochus and the Seleucid dynasty is now in desperate need of funds. So what Antiochus does is he goes and tries to pillage a temple in the east, and he ends up being killed. He's killed, and his son, Seleucus IV, takes over in the year 187. But you have the same concern for finances even after Seleucus IV takes over. So what Seleucus IV does in the text that we're going to read in a moment is he seems to create certain administrative structures that will allow him access to the funds that are stored in all temples in Israel, which again are not just the temple in Jerusalem, it's the temple of the Samaritans, it's pagan temples. Any temple in Koile, Syria, basically from Lebanon all the way south, is now going to be brought under the jurisdiction of the Seleucid dynasty, so that now the Seleucid dynasty will have access to their funds. And the letter known as the Heliodorus Stele. I don't know how many of you have been to what's called Dig for a Day in Beit Guvrin Archaeological Park. So in the Beit Guvrin Archaeological Park, they actually discovered in 1909 the text that we're going to be reading. the Heliodorus stele. And it's called the Heliodorus stele. You can just turn to page 2. The sort of arranged as almost like an email chain. The top 2 letters, it seems to have been sent and resent. The actual letter itself is at the top of page 2. And what we have is a letter in which Seleucus IV, writes to someone named Heliodorus. And what he says to this person named Heliodorus, some agent of his, he writes as follows. He says that, we'll read from the very beginning here. Taking the utmost consideration for the safety of our subjects, and thinking it to be of the greatest good for the affairs in our realm, when those living in our kingdom manage their lives without fear. And at the same time, realizing that nothing can enjoy its fitting prosperity without the goodwill of the gods. So meaning I have two things that I need to keep in mind, Lucas is saying. I need to make sure that the temples in Coile, Syria are being run properly, because if they're not being run properly, then the people who worship in those temples have something to fear, namely the wrath of the gods, and is sort of point number 1. Point number 2 is he wants to ensure that they maintain the goodwill of the gods. So in order to make sure that they maintain the goodwill of the gods, and in doing so, that the people who live in his empire don't have to worry about incurring the wrath of the gods, he is going to, so therefore he says from the outset, and this is the important part, we have made it our concern to ensure that the sanctuaries founded in the other satrapies receive the ancestral honors with the proper service. So what he's done is he's ensured that the other areas that are under Seleucid control to the east, Mesopotamia, etc., are now being run by some sort of Seleucid overseer who's responsible just to ensure that everything is being run properly in these temples. However, as the affairs in Coile, Syria, and Phoenicia lack someone in charge for the care of these things, that is the sanctuaries, we thought that someone named Olympiodorus would prudently see to their proper conduct. Okay, so there is this person named Olympiodorus who is being appointed in the year 178 as the person who is now supposed to supervise the smooth running of all temples in Coile, Syria, which means Jerusalem, which means the Samaritan temple, which means other pagan temples everywhere from Lebanon down south. Now, why exactly would Seleucus be interested? Why is it so important 10 years into his reign that he set up someone who is going to be responsible for the smooth operations of all these temples? As we're going to see, it's because he needed to make sure that he had people who could get him access to the funds that are being stored in these temples. That seems to have been his primary concern. Not so much that he was worried that maybe the Jews weren't doing the avodah and the mikdash properly. What he was more concerned with is, can I get access to the funds in those temples? Now, what about the problem that I said before, namely that there was always going to be a concern for committing acts of sacrilege? So one possibility that historians entertain is that this Olympiodorus was actually being appointed as the high priest of all temples in Coile, Syria, meaning you would now have basically one kind of uber high priest, and then the high priests of the local temples would basically have to answer to him. In which case, really, what this Olympiodorus was being given was basically jurisdiction over all temples. This is important because what this suggests is that the first aspect of Judean autonomy is being eroded by Seleucus IV in the year 178. What I said before is that autonomy in antiquity was regarded as consisting of 3 things: autonomy from military garrison, freedom from military garrison, freedom from having to pay tribute, and freedom to observe your ancestral traditions. What Seleucus IV is doing is he's eroding the sort of right to not pay tribute to the Seleucid dynasty. They had never really enjoyed freedom from military garrison. There were always soldiers that were quartered there, even if they weren't there in order to maintain the peace. They were probably there more for administrative purposes. But now, after this edict from Seleucus that is preserved in the Heliodorus stele, what you end up having is you only have the Jewish right to observe their ancestral traditions. The story that we're going to skip, but feel free to read it later, is that in 2 Maccabees chapter 3, you actually have the Heliodorus that was the recipient of the letter that we just read. This Heliodorus is described in 2 Maccabees chapter 3 as actually being sent by Seleucus in order to extract funds from the Jerusalem temple. Meaning, we actually have evidence from 2 Maccabees that Seleucus acted on this impulse. The impulse that he's going to set up certain people who are going to serve as overseers over the temple. Heliodorus being somehow involved in this. He sends Heliodorus to the Jerusalem temple because he hears that the Jews are withholding money that Seleucus says that he and his dynasty are entitled to. So you have concrete proof that what Seleucus has done is eroded the second prong in Judean autonomy as given to them by his father, Antiochus III, namely freedom from financial interference. What 2 Maccabees chapter 3 says at the end, basically the story in 2 Maccabees chapter 3 is this Heliodorus tries to enter the temple, and when he tries to do so, he is struck down by angels. Basically, he's beaten by angels. Why was he beaten by angels? And what Heliodorus explains to Seleucus IV is it's because God protects the temple. And he basically says to Seleucus IV, if you want to extract those funds, I recommend that you send your worst enemy, because your worst enemy is going to be beaten like I was. Why is that? Because God protects his people and protects their temple. And what 2 Maccabees says, again, attributes this statement to Heliodorus himself. What 2 Maccabees says is Heliodorus acknowledged that as long as the Jews are pious and observe God's law, God will protect them. And God will protect the temple. Okay, so this is sort of like the first phase that we need to consider when we think about why exactly does Antiochus end up persecuting the Jews. Okay, let's continue. What happens from there? So that the Heliodorus stele, the story that we just read in 2 Maccabees 3, is taking place in the year 178. Seleucus IV dies in the year 175, and that's when Antiochus of the Hanukkah story ends up being appointed as king. Antiochus IV is the son of Antiochus III, the king who takes over Koile, Syria in the year 198, and the brother of Seleucus IV. Okay, he actually had been taken hostage by the Romans after the Peace of Apamea. Remember the peace treaty that ended the war between Rome and the Seleucid dynasty that resulted in that massive war indemnity also required that Antiochus III give his son, Antiochus IV, as a hostage to Rome. So actually, while Antiochus III was finishing up his reign as king and Seleucus IV was succeeding him, Antiochus IV was a hostage in Rome. He's released in 175 to succeed his brother Seleucus IV. Now, what happens when he takes over in the year 175? So what 2 Maccabees tells us is that in 175, a Kohen in Jerusalem named Jason goes to Antiochus and purchases the rights to the high priest. So who is this Jason? So we're familiar with the person from rabbinic literature named Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik is described as the last member of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. He had multiple sons. He was succeeded as Kohen Gadol by his son named Onias III, probably Yochanan III, and he had a second son. Shimon HaTzadik had a second son named Jason. We don't know what his Hebrew name would have been. He's only referred to in 2 Maccabees. Jason, this son of Shimon HaTzadik, goes to Antiochus and purchases the rights to the Kahuna Gedola so that his brother, Onias III, has been deposed. Right? Don't worry about the names. The important point here is to Kohanim, the rightful Kohen Gadol is removed from his post because his brother purchases the rights to the Kahuna Gedola from Antiochus IV. Now, why would Antiochus IV have been interested in giving the rights to the Kahuna Gedola to this Jason? Because he still was on the hook for that massive war indemnity. The massive war indemnity actually was supposed to be paid off a few years earlier, but for some reason wasn't, presumably because Seleucus IV never got access to all of the funds that he needed. So in the year 175, Antiochus still needs money. And so he's not interested in who controls the high priesthood in Jerusalem. What he is interested in is making sure that he has the funds in order to pay off the last of that war indemnity. So he sells rights to the high priesthood for a massive sum of money to this person named Jason. But as part of this purchase, Jason doesn't only acquire the rights to the high priesthood, he also purchases the rights to institute certain changes in Jerusalem life. So he's not. So Jason, you're saying Jason? So he's the king, right? So if Olympiodorus, this person that I referred to earlier, is sort of Uber Kohen Gadol, and Antiochus has control over everything that takes place in his domain. and there's a right, and there's a Kohen Gadol who is the current Kohen Gadol, how are you going to depose that person? You're going to need the backing of the king, who basically can enforce your rights to become Kohen. So that seems to be why he gets involved in this at all. Now, the other thing that he does is he introduces certain Hellenistic innovations. This is sort of the beginning of the penetration of sort of sustained Hellenism. And the term Hellenism, which has to do with sort of Greek influence, is actually coined by the author of Second Maccabees to explain what it is that Jason did. Jason does a number of things. He gets rights to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem, basically a place where you would have youth engaging in Greek athletics. He acquires the rights to build an ephebia. An ephebia basically is sort of school where you would have youth being educated in philosophy and the classics and rhetoric and other things. And he acquires the right to sort of establish Jerusalem as a Greek city, as a Greek polis. Now, Second Maccabees condemns Jason and basically says the reason for the persecutions, which haven't happened yet, we're still just in the year 175, the reason for the persecutions is it was a divine punishment for Jason having introduced these Greek innovations into Jerusalem life. So you can just take a look at middle of page 3, verse 16, that bolded section in the middle of the page. For this reason, heavy disaster overtook them, and those whose ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies and avengers. It is no light thing to show impiety to the divine laws, a fact that later events will make clear. Second Maccabees doesn't really accuse Jason of violating halacha. It doesn't say he stopped worshiping in the mikdash. He doesn't say he stopped functioning as a Kohen Gadol. He doesn't say that he reversed his bris milah, stopped observing Shabbos, things like that. He says that the arch crime that he committed was introducing these unfamiliar practices into Israel. And for that, Second Maccabees says that's why the persecutions happened. So Second Maccabees is not going to really provide us with a historical answer to our question, why exactly does Antiochus persecute the Jews? His answer is going to be a theological answer, namely that this was a punishment. Now, the theological answer is satisfying theologically, but if we want to know what exactly was Antiochus's his motivation, Antiochus the person, that's not going to satisfy our historical question, even if it does satisfy a sort of theological understanding. Okay, that's what happens in the year 175. Antiochus hasn't begun eroding any other part of Jewish autonomy, but he has introduced certain complications into Jerusalem life by intruding himself into Jewish politics in a way that the Seleucid dynasty hadn't before. Even if nothing really has changed, he hasn't withdrawn Jewish rights to observe their ancestral traditions. He's allowed the Jews to introduce certain new things, but nothing that we would consider to be a persecution. Now, the story gets even more complicated from here. Jason now is Kohen Gadol in the year 175, but he in turn is deposed and is outbid by another Kohen. This other Kohen is named Menelaus. Menelaus in the year 172 goes to Antiochus and says, I want to be Kohen Gadol. I don't have the rights to being Kohen Gadol. I am a Kohen. I'm not from the family of the Gadol, right? Jason was still at least the son of the previous Kohen Gadol, but this Menelaus doesn't actually have the rights to the position at all. But he goes to Antiochus and says in the year 172, I will pay you even more than Jason if you appoint me as Kohen Gadol. That's what he does. Antiochus is still in need of funds. It was just then, actually, that Antiochus managed to pay off that indemnity, basically with the help of the funds that came from Jason. In the year 173, he finally paid off that indemnity. But now Antiochus turns his attention to a different enterprise, which is conquering Egypt. Remember, I said before that there had been 5 Syrian wars waged between the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty over the course of the 3rd century. The Seleucid dynasty under Antiochus IV now wants to go and take not just Coile Syria, but wants to take Egypt itself. And in order to do this, he's going to have to raise further funds. And so it's not a coincidence then that he is eager to oust Jason from the position of Kohen Gadol and to appoint Menelaus. That's what ends up happening. The impression that we form about Menelaus from Second Maccabees is he wasn't interested in Hellenism, he wasn't interested in Greek ways. He was interested in power. He was interested in prestige. That's why he acquires the rights to the Gedola. There doesn't seem at any point through all this to have been any opposition on the part of other Jews in Jerusalem to Hellenism. It's not that Jason introduces these Hellenistic reforms and the Jews revolt. There seems to have been quiet. It seems not to have been controversial at the time that Jason was building a gymnasium, was educating Jews in Jerusalem in Greek classics. He wasn't violating halacha. Jews in general were receptive to it. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone necessarily embraced it, but it also seems not to have been especially controversial. Okay, so that's where things kind of stand in the year when we get to the year 168. By the year 168, Antiochus has waged a campaign against Egypt. He failed to take Egypt. And in 168, he decides he's going to mount a second campaign against Egypt. And this is going to be the Sixth Syrian War. Sixth Syrian War that is being fought in the year 168, is the subject of 2 Maccabees 5, turn to page 4 at the top. So the year 168, remember Menelaus is now the About this time, Antiochus made his second invasion of Egypt. When news of what had happened reached the king, so what happens? Let's read the intervening section here. When a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no fewer than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault on the city. So Jason, remember, had been deposed 4 years earlier. Here's a rumor that Antiochus has been killed in this campaign against Egypt, and he takes the opportunity to make a comeback, to challenge Menelaus and try to retake the Kahuna Gedola. He did not, however, gain control of the government. In the end, he got only disgrace from his conspiracy and fled again into Antiochus. Okay, now it turns out that Antiochus had not actually been killed. And what we hear in verse 11 is when news of what had happened reached the king, he took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. So raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by force. What does he do? He takes the city by force, which over the course of basically the next 20 verses, you hear involves him massacring the city. He kills almost 100,000 people, takes almost 100,000 people as slaves, builds a substantial military fortress in Jerusalem, installs more than 20,000 soldiers in this military garrison, and pillages the temple, basically extracts massive amounts of money from the temple, all because he heard that Judea was in revolt. So there is the beginnings of what sound like the persecutions that have something to do with a perceived revolt in the year 168 and something to do with his campaign against Egypt. Now, it turns out that his campaign against Egypt had failed. So what I want to think about is, what did his failed campaign have to do with why he responded so aggressively to what was this perceived revolt on the part of the Jews? So how does his campaign end? So let's take a look at, actually, before we get to that, the next thing that he does, besides killing about 100,000 Jews and enslaving about 100,000 Jews, massacring, pillaging the temple, installing a military garrison that includes 20,000 soldiers. Aside from that, we'll hear at the beginning of chapter 6, in the year 167, is the beginning of the persecutions. And this is the bottom of page 4. Not long after this, an Athenian senator, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Judeans to forsake their ancestral laws and no longer to live by the laws of God. Just take a look at verse 3 toward the bottom of the page. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil, for the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the nations, who dallied with prostitutes and had intercourse with women within sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath, nor observe their ancestral feasts, nor so much as confess themselves to be Judeans. On the monthly celebrations of the king's birthday, the Judeans were taken under bitter constraint to partake of the sacrifices, and when a feast of Dionysus was celebrated, they were compelled to wear wreaths of ivy and to walk in the procession in honor of Dionysus. Second Maccabees then editorializes, again, this is consistent with the theology of Second Maccabees, and he writes as follows in verse 12 at the top of page 5. Now I urge those who read this book not to be depressed by such calamities, but to recognize that these punishments were designed not to destroy, but to discipline our people. Meaning, Second Maccabees is not interested in the historical question that we're asking, but the theological question. Why exactly did God allow these persecutions to take place? His answer is that this was divine punishment. And for the Hellenizing reforms introduced into Jerusalem by Jason 7 years before this. In fact, he goes on in verse 13, it is a sign of great kindness not to let the impious alone for long, but to punish them immediately. For in the case of the other nations, the Lord waits patiently to punish them until they have reached the full measure of their sins, but he does not deal in this way with us in order that he may not take vengeance on us after. Meaning he wanted to take care of us quickly because he wanted to make sure that we were punished immediately and that he would then reconcile. So that's basically the story of the book: is he punishes them, reconciles with them, and the miracle is what we're going to talk about next week. But what I want to do, and I think this is sort of the critical passage, I'm not going to, I know there are a couple of questions I'm not running anywhere. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions, but in the last 5 minutes that we have, I want to look at how the campaign against Egypt ends and to try to make sense of why Antiochus responded so aggressively to this persecution. Remember, second campaign against Egypt, in which Antiochus tries to retake Egypt, ends in failure in the year 168. He hears that a rebellion has broken out in Judea, comes back, puts it down aggressively. What's the connection between his failed campaign and the persecutions? So this passage at the bottom of page 5, the last source on the sheet, is from the Roman historian Polybius, who describes how this campaign ends. He writes as follows: at the time when Antiochus approached Ptolemy and meant to occupy Pelusium, basically he's at the gates of Alexandria, he's about to take Egypt, Egypt is about to fall to Antiochus. Caius Popilius Linus, the Roman commander, on Antiochus greeting him from a distance and then holding out his hands, handed to the king as he had it by him the copy of the Senatus Consultum and told him to read it first. So what's happened? Rome has now taken control of the Near East going back 20 years, right? After they defeated the coalition involving Antiochus in the year 188, Rome basically became the de facto rulers over the Near East. And when they hear that Antiochus is trying to mount a campaign against Egypt and is basically going to take Egypt in the year 168, they send one of their leaders, a senator whose name, the commander's name is Caius Popilius Linus, to stop Antiochus, to say you have control over your empire, including Coile Syria. You cannot press forward against Egypt, because they were concerned about Antiochus once again amassing too much power. So this Roman commander comes with an official letter from the Senate, tells Antiochus to read it first, fourth line here, not thinking, we have 3 more minutes, not thinking it proper, as it seems to me, to make the conventional sign of friendship before he knew if the intentions of him who was greeting him were friendly or hostile. So he says, before I am willing to express either my friendliness or my hostility, I need to know how you're going to respond. Are you going to withdraw like this letter from the Senate requires, or are you going to press forward? But when the king, after reading it, said he would like to communicate with his friends, Popilius acted in a manner which was thought to be offensive and exceedingly arrogant. He was carrying a stick cut from a vine, and with this he drew a circle around Antiochus and told him he must remain inside this circle until he gave his decision about the contents of his life. Basically, to put it in terms that I would say to my children, he put him in a timeout, right? Puts a circle around Antiochus, says you can't leave the circle until you tell me whether or not you are going to comply with the Roman demand that you retreat, or whether you insist on going forward, in which case I'm going to side with the Egyptians. Popilius Linus, is going to side with the Egyptians and wage war against you. The king was astonished at this authoritative proceeding, but after a few moments' hesitation, said he would do all that the Romans demanded. Upon this, Popilius and his suite all grasped him by the hand and greeted him warmly. Right? Antiochus understands he doesn't have a choice. The letter ordered him to put an end at once to the war with Ptolemy. So as a fixed number of days were allowed to him, he led his army back to Syria, deeply hurt and complaining, but yielding to circumstances. That's how the campaign against Egypt ends. The passage that we saw in 2 Maccabees says, just as that campaign ends, Antiochus hears that Judea is in revolt. And that's when he massacres the city, pillages the temple, institutes the persecutions. What's the connection between them? So I think we can talk about two slightly different formulations, but each of which adds up to a political reason, just to go back to the point that was made before, rather than the actions of a religious zealot. Antiochus has now been shamed. And apparently this shaming of Antiochus was done publicly in a way that might have called into question his authority. Because basically what the Romans were saying was, we are the ones with ultimate supremacy, and we require that you defer to us. So what is it that Antiochus does? Antiochus then, upon hearing about the news of this perceived revolt, just at that moment, takes the opportunity to suppress that revolt in a very heavy-handed way, not because he was interested in persecuting the Jews, but because he was interested in showing that he was still in charge, that he still enjoyed ultimate power, at least in Coele, Syria. And how does he do that? He does that by reversing the last remnants, the vestiges of the autonomy that had been granted to them, to the Jews, by his father Antiochus III. No military garrison, no tribute, freedom to observe their ancestral traditions. What is Antiochus doing? He's saying, you've already been deprived of freedom from tribute. I'm going to install a military garrison in Jerusalem with 20,000 soldiers, and I'm then going to I'm going to pillage the temple, right? Again, freedom from tribute, freedom from having to make payments, and I'm going to deprive you of your rights to your ancestral traditions. Why is it that he pursues that new policy so aggressively? It's not because he is especially interested in depriving them of their rights to be Jewish. It's because he needs to make a display of power that shows that he is ultimately still the one who is in charge. He may have been rebuffed in his efforts to take Egypt, but his point is he remains firmly in control of what had always been his domain, namely Coele, Syria, and Mesopotamia to the east. None of this changes the basic outlines of the Hanukkah, meaning basically you have the persecutions, you have the response of the Hashmonaim, you have the miracles that will result in the victory of the Hashmonaim. But in terms of what Antiochus's own motivation was, it makes sense within the framework of the political events of his day that he wasn't a religious zealot. If he changed the policies of his dynasty, it wasn't because he was interested in suppressing Jewish rights or that he was an anti-Semite. He was acting as a political animal would, namely responding to what had been a very shameful end to a failed campaign in the year 168. Okay, we're out of time. I'm not going anywhere, so if anybody has any questions, happy to answer questions. Again, next week we're going to talk about what happens next, namely the end of the persecution. Okay, hold on a second. So we don't actually know how many. Everybody's free to leave. We don't actually know how many Jews were in Israel at the time. What the Dari Mincha? Okay. Okay, so again, I'm not going anywhere, but we're going to have Mincha. I'm happy to stick around. I guess we can resume in about 10 minutes. Yeah.
So this time I really heard it.
Yeah.
I was not sleeping because I was Friday night. And I stayed up all night. So it was very good.
Thank you.
Better than what I heard Friday night.